Manchester United 1, Manchester City 6. A result described by then manager Sir Alex Ferguson as the worst in my history. The 10-goal difference swing that day ultimately ended up deciding the Premier League title as City won it at the death. Mark, how was it symbolic as the end of an era for United?
Well, there's lots of reasons, but first of all, United under Ferguson never experienced a home defeat like that. They'd lost some away games. There was a couple of 5-0s at Newcastle and Chelsea. They were blips, but I think both those years they won the league. On this occasion, City were the rising force. Ferguson had called them the noisy neighbours a couple of years earlier. He dismissed them a few times. He said they were a small club with a small mentality. He couldn't quite get his head around the fact that City were a force that were there to be reckoned with. He felt that he didn't really give City the respect that he gave to Liverpool or Arsenal. He felt those were true clubs, true heavyweight clubs, and he felt that City were upstarts. He didn't really believe that they were going to come good. And this was a day when it was obvious. You know, they were spending United off the pitch. I outspend United off the pitch massively. Ferguson accused them of kamikaze spending. There was an element of Ferguson not wanting to believe it. But this was the day then when City turned up and hammered United, humiliated United. I think from that point on, it was clear that City were the rising force, and United's team that day was old. It was creaking. It lacked ideas. It lacked energy. The poor recruitment of years gone by was starting to show. They had an old team of people like Rio Ferdinand, Nemanja Vidic, Ryan Giggs, the players that had had their best days. City were the rising force, and although United took City to the wire that season in terms of the title race, they lost it on goal difference, and the 10-goal swing in that game that gave City the title. They won it by a goal difference of +8. So had United not lost so heavily, they could have won the league. But that for me set the tone. It was a day that it showed that City were on the up and United were on the way down.
Fergie left obviously in 2013, and that summer David Gill left as well. I mean, it's often said that those two departing at the same time was sort of a double blow that few clubs could have recovered from. I mean, is that kind of how you see it, or should there have been more of a succession plan, more of a kind of stepping up internally in terms of taking responsibility when two big figures like that leave the club?
Well, there should have been a succession plan, and United will argue there was a succession plan. The succession plan was promoting Ed Woodward from his role as commercial director to executive vice chairman or David Gill's job, but Ed Woodward wasn't cut out for it. And I think as the years have passed, we've realised how important David Gill was. Gill had the connections in the transfer market, he knew the agents, he knew the clubs. He was very well regarded and respected, David Gill. Nobody will say that David Gill was bad at his job. People might think that he was, classic Man United in the sense that United got their way a lot of the times, but that was because they were a powerful club. But David Gill knew the market, he knew the club. I think with Ed Woodward coming in at the same time as David Moyes, there was kind of naivety and inexperience in the two key positions at the club. And had David Gill stayed to guide David Moyes through his first year in charge, I think it would have been different. I think it would have enabled United to get get players in that summer. I think United really struggled. They brought Marlon Fellaini, and it was a disaster. I think David Gill would have been a much better guiding hand and would have negotiated the transition much better with Gill in charge as the chief exec. But, Ed Woodward took the club in a different direction. David Moyes, then Louis van Gaal came in. But, Gill leaving, who knows what will happen at City, whether Bergerstein's departure will be seen as such a big thing. But I think it could be. I think Gill and Ferguson were joined at the hip. They had a real respect for each other. And Gill was one of the very few people that could stand up to Sir Alex Ferguson and tell him he was wrong. And that is crucial as well. You need a powerful figure at a club to be told sometimes, tell truth to power. Bergerstein can tell that to Pep Guardiola. Gill could say it to Ferguson. I don't think when Woodward came in, the same respect was there from the players or even the manager. I think David Moyes was infuriated at times by Ed Woodward. And I think that carried on with Van Gaal, with Mourinho. So they lost a real power broker, the brains trust. And that's why United, their decline was accelerated by the fact that they had novices off the pitch as well as on it.
Rob, I mean, obviously, United won the title in Fergie's final season. Robin van Persie, a fantastic signing, top goal scorer, kind of delivered them the league, made the difference that year. But do you think there were signs, perhaps, that Sir Alex Ferguson's judgment was waning a little bit in the market in terms of their signings? Did that have any factor in what came after that? The squad that David Moyes inherited did have some fundamental problems that perhaps should have been addressed a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly made some mistakes towards the end of Sir Alex Ferguson's time. They didn't really reinvest the money that they got from Cristiano Ronaldo's sale to Real Madrid in the right way. I know lots of fans were particularly underwhelmed with the players that were brought in after Ronaldo had gone. Also, they lost Tevez to City, which was not only an embarrassment really that he ended up at City, but also a massive chunk of that forward line that had won the Champions League in 2008 with Tevez, Ronaldo, and Rooney. I think then it was almost like a perfect storm that you've got an aging squad. You've not really sort of made the right moves to kind of re-energize it. I'd done a United piece with Frans Herk relatively recently, who was Louis van Gaal's goalkeeping coach, who said that one of the first things that United had told Van Gaal and his coaching staff when he came in was that this squad is old and that they shouldn't have really won the title in 2013. They won the title in 2013 because Van Persie had been so fantastic, and that was the only real reason why they'd won it. And that a situation there from that team that Evra, Vidic, Ferdinand all left in the same summer, I think. Van Persie just wasn't the same player again after 2013. You've got Ed Woodward, as Marcus said, coming in to try and help David Moyes, two inexperienced people in their roles. And also the market was changing at the same time, that historically under Fergie, United would be able to go to big Premier League teams and take their best player. You're thinking of examples like Michael Carrick, where you just go to Tottenham and go, right, we're having him, and he comes, and that's it. The market was changing at that time, whereas with other Premier League clubs having a lot of money, that United couldn't do that. And I remember speaking to Woodward a few times where he said, it would have been better for him if Fergie had stayed for one more year, so he got to work with Ferguson and then had kind of tried to oversee this transition. But also he struggled in the market because the way that David Gill used to be able to operate, he just couldn't do it, because you couldn't go to Premier League teams anymore and just pluck their best player out of there. So United had this perfect storm between sort of 2011, 2015, 16, where they just got so much wrong. There was so much against them. And to be honest, they're still paying the price for it now. We're talking about the best part of 10 years later, and they're still paying the price for that little period where they just didn't get anything right.
It did start on the Fergie. I mean, I'm just... So when he retired in 2013, he had Giggs, who was 39, Scholes was 38. You had Rio Ferdinand 34, Vidic 31, Petrucci 32, Michael Carrick 31. So that shows you the team have got old, and Ferguson denies that, but there's no denying it. And Pep Guardiola's saying the same things, by the way. This team isn't getting old. It is. But I look back through Ferguson's book, and he made this kind of telling quote about the players that he kind of left behind as the next generation. And he got it wrong, massively wrong. He said, I had a core of players who were sure to improve. Rafael da Silva, Phil Jones, Chris Smalling, David De Gea, Tom Cleverley, Danny Welbeck, Javier Hernandez, and Anderson. Now, all of those players were probably good squad players. I think David De Gea was probably better than that, but good squad players, nothing more than that. They were nowhere near capable of replacing the players that went before them. But
didn't you once say Phil Jones was like the best United,
best player
United player ever?
Yeah,
I don't care.
Yeah, it was. That was. I don't know what to say about that really, but that's what he said. He said, but at the time, he had this phrase. Whenever Ferguson was being questioned about the spending, they were going nowhere near what City was spending. He said, I'm looking for value in the market. And a lot of fans, even now, will say that what Ferguson was doing was basically doing the bidding for the Glazers, because without getting too deep into the weeds of this, back at that point, it was just after the financial crash, the global crash, and the Glazers were really struggling. The interest on the loan, which was used to buy the club, was getting bigger and bigger. They had real problems. And there even to this day, there are question marks as to whether they sold Ronaldo for £80 million. It was a cash deal straight up front. That was done to basically keep the banks at bay. So United were in a mess at the time, and Ferguson was almost like tacit in allowing these signings to happen. That they were going for players that were never going to be good enough at low fees. Chris Smalling, Valencia, all these players that weren't quite up to the mark. And that was his legacy. His legacy was as a winning, incredible manager, but his legacy was also the team that he left behind and the players he left behind.
Was there also part of it was the sort of cult of the manager? I always remember reading Sir Alex Ferguson's book, the one that Paul Hayward did, and control was such a big theme throughout that. You always talked about, I needed to have control at all times. And when you sort of compare what Arsenal did in the post-Wenger era, where they sort of tried to strip the autonomy, or did strip the autonomy from the manager, they appointed Unai Emery, they made him head coach, they appointed all these new department heads, tried to get a load of football expertise in around the club and sort of divest that responsibility away from one man. It felt as though, I mean, ironically, of course, what Arsenal have done under Arteta is kind of give a lot of that back to one man. But this is the sort of vagaries of trying to run a top level club, I suppose. But do you think that idea that one man is the Messiah, one man can still be the autonomous or, all conquering force, that lingered too long at United. For succession managers who followed Ferguson, they had to sort of be that role, and there wasn't enough expertise, there wasn't enough people taking responsibility around that individual, and that they held on to that idea too long.
Oh, 100%. Way too long. I mean, Rob, the same as me. I had conversations with Ed Woodward going back to 2013. We said, no, this is our model. The manager's in charge. We don't want a technical director or sporting director. And it went on for probably a good 4 or 5 years. They brought in Louis van Gaal to be the Ferguson type. They felt that David Moyes was didn't have the credentials or the personality that they needed. So they brought in Louis van Gaal, who was, probably worse than David Moyes in the sense that he wasted so much money. So yes, they waited and waited, and then they wanted to bring in a sporting director under Jose Mourinho, but he vetoed it. Or he wouldn't work with the suggestion. So also there's a sense that this was Ed Woodward's train set in many ways. He wanted to play, fantasy football manager, and he did quite a lot. You look at some of the players that he signed. So even now, I mean, 2025, they're under Ineos control. They're still making mistakes. They still haven't got it right. They're still 5 or 6, 7 years behind other clubs. And I think Jim Ratcliffe said recently in an interview that United's data and their scouting is in the last century. So it shows how far behind they are.
It's interesting that Radcliffe would say that, because essentially United, after Ferguson, almost had to start from scratch because he took over in 1986. Football was a very different business in 1986. And you could have a manager who was involved in everything, who kind of took ownership of everything. In 1986, Fergie was still running youth team sessions 2 nights a week on a Tuesday and Thursday. Now, that just shows you the kind of landscape that football was at the time. And the club got so big and so successful during Ferguson's reign that it was almost allowed to grow around him, that he was almost like every single department head, because he was a freak in the way that he worked and the way that he was able to kind of squeeze success out of everything. But when you remove a man like that, you're left with a shell, an empty shell, and it can't be filled by anyone else apart from that one man. And that's what David Moyes found, that essentially that it was billed as this kind of perfect job, everything's set up for success. All you have to do is kind of steer the team. Well, that was completely wrong. He was asked to fill a Fergie-shaped hole when he was clearly never going to be that. And what happened is they've had to strip back the club and start almost building the club behind the scenes from scratch. And Mark mentions there about data. The same is true about recruitment. All these departments that didn't really have to function because Fergie was all of these things wrapped into one. United have had to start to try and build from scratch. And again, they're still trying to do it now. And we're talking about more than 10 years on from Fergie retiring.
It's impossible to overstate, what a big personality he was. I remember being on the pre-season tours that United had back in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And they used to do it a lot bigger than anybody else. United were really the kind of the forerunners of pre-season tours. It was like being on Air Force One and traveling with the President of the United States, because he everywhere he went, he was the most famous person in the room, in the building, in the city. People would, stop the clocks because Ferguson was there. It was absolutely huge. There's nothing quite like him. And, Pep Guardiola at Man City is a massive figure, but he hasn't yet become the Ferguson figure, because there are other people at the club that are just as important. Ferguson, he suffocated everybody around him because he was such a big personality, and he kind of encouraged that as well. It wasn't that he didn't see it coming, thinking, I need to delegate here. He delegated on the training pitch, but he was always the boss. He was always the guy that was in charge. So when he left, Woodward would say that there was a black hole there, a black hole in many senses, that in terms of scouting, but also his presence. And, they tried everything. They tried Moyes, they tried Van Gaal, they tried Mourinho, all these, the big personalities, the small personalities, the Fergie clone, the ex-player, and none of it worked, because even now, he was on the pitch at the weekend when the Dennis Law tribute. Ferguson, everything stops for Fergie. And he's just got an incredible presence.
This is obviously a sort of secondary point, and I guess maybe it's more symptomatic of everything that we've been discussing. But I sort of think about the way that Carrington has, been left behind by other more progressive training grounds, and obviously the stadium, Old Trafford, has fallen into a bit of a state of disrepair, and they're talking about, maybe knocking it down and building a new one or renovating it, whatever they're going to do this summer. I mean, I always think about I speak to agents when they're talking about moving a player into a Premier League club, and they talk about having tours of training grounds and stadiums and things. And, Spurs I think Spurs is probably the best combination in England, actually, of stadium and training ground. The facilities are unbelievable. Think about what Liverpool have done in the last few years to Anfield. Obviously, Everton are building a new stadium. There's City have got the Etihad, which is, sort of still relatively, I was going to say state of the art, but still very modern anyway, certainly by comparison to Old Trafford. I mean, how much of a contributing factor to the sort of decline and fall of Manchester United are the fact that the facilities have sort of fallen behind even some of their more modest Premier League rivals?
I think it's just a symbol, another symbol of the decline, that particularly when that Carrington facility opened, it was billed as the best training ground in the world, and it probably was. But in the meantime, City have moved from Platt Lane in Manchester to Carrington, next door to United's training ground, and then moved out of that Carrington facility back into a state-of-the-art facility opposite the Etihad Stadium. And that sums up how much United have just stood still. They've not reinvested. They've not invested in the training facilities to keep it at the top of European football. Anyone that's been to Old Trafford will know that it's the same with the stadium. I mean, everyone's seen the leaky roof. There's videos of rats and mice on the pitch during games. It's just a more evidence of the decline of the entire club. That the team was the best in Europe not that long ago. The facilities were the best in Europe not that long ago, and now they've been overtaken by almost everyone.
But I mean, I was told a story by somebody who works at United, and this is kind of, it's the elephant in the room that we haven't really discussed. It's the Glazers, and it's the Glazer family and their ownership of the club, and how since 2005, much of the money that United earned goes on interest payments and paying the debt on the loan that was used to buy the club. So the lack of investment in the club dates back to 2005. But I was told, I asked this person, I said, when United go to America, why do they never go to Tampa? Why do they never go to, because obviously, James, that Arsenal will do a link up with the LA Rams or with whoever Kroenke's teams are. Liverpool did it with FSG in Boston. They spend a lot of time. The United have never gone anywhere near Tampa, where, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are what the Glazers own in the US. And I was told it's quite simply because the owners didn't want the United squad to see how good the Tampa Bay facilities were. They didn't want to see the training ground, because the training ground at Tampa is meant to be state of the art. The stadium, again, is a top stadium. The Glazers have put a lot of money into the facility at Tampa. And if the players had gone to Tampa Bay Buccaneers training ground and realised what they had and what United don't have, there might have been a mutiny at the club. So that explains why Old Trafford and Carrington have fallen behind, because the owners, the Glazers, haven't put any money in. It's always been going out, £70 million a year on dividends, on interest payments, on, director fees, consultancy fees. United are paying for the privilege of having the Glazers as their owners. So that's why Old Trafford and the Carrington and the team has fallen behind, because of the owners.